My parents' anniversary was supposed to be family unity, and then my sister crowned her son king and ordered my 12-year-old to serve him. My daughter said one word, no, and then a belt came off, bones cracked, and 50 adults stayed seated right in front. Tell me, is silence abuse too? If you're interested in this topic, hit the like button, subscribe, and type interested in the comments. And I will give you a heart. My name is Talia Brooks, and if you've ever sat in a family celebration where you knew you were the target before you even walked in, then you already understand the feeling I had pulling into that venue parking lot with my daughter, Lila, in the passenger seat, her hands folded in her lap like she was bracing for impact. It was my parents' 50th wedding anniversary, the kind of event they wanted photographed, posted, praised, and talked about for months, and my mother kept calling it a night of unity. Which is funny, because unity in my family has always meant one thing. Everybody agrees to pretend the same lie at the same time. The lie is that we're close. The lie is that we're kind. The lie is that my older sister Marin isn't the center of gravity, and the rest of us aren't just objects pulled into her orbit. The venue looked like it had been designed by someone who thinks classy means expensive enough to intimidate you. Chandeliers like upside-down waterfalls, white tablecloths so crisp they looked ironed with resentment, servers in gloves, gold chairs that wobbled if you shifted your weight, and the kind of floral centerpieces that scream, "Don't touch anything or you'll be judged." Lila was 12, quiet in that smart, observant way, not timid, not weak, just aware, and she had learned early that certain rooms are not safe even when everyone is smiling. I told her softly, "Stay close to me," and she nodded without asking why, because she already knew why. As soon as we walked in, I saw Marin. Of course, she was early. Marin always arrives early to stake her claim, to set the tone, to make sure the oxygen in the room belongs to her first. She was by the head table, posed like she owned the venue, her dress sharp and expensive, hair perfect, smile wide and empty, and beside her was her son, Kane, 11 years old, already practicing entitlement like it was a sport. He had that look kids get when the adults around them have been clapping for bad behavior their whole life, that smug calm that says, "I can do what I want and no one will stop me." Marin saw us and lit up like a spotlight turned on. "Well, look who made it," she said, bright voice, fake warmth. "I was wondering if you'd show." I kept my face neutral. Neutral is a survival skill.
"We're on time," I said.
She tilted her head, eyes scanning Lila like she was inventory. "Lila, sweetie, you looked adorable," she said, stretching the word like she was forcing herself to be polite. Then she looked at Kane. "Say hi." Kane barely glanced at Lila. "Hi," he mumbled like she was a cashier. Marin laughed, that sharp little laugh people do when they're trying to make rudeness sound charming. "He's just honest," she announced to anyone listening. "I love that." And right there, if you've got good instincts, you'd have felt it too. The warning that the night was already loaded, because when someone loves disrespect, they're telling you what they'll defend later. My parents had assigned seats, and ours were exactly where they always put me. Close enough to be included, far enough to be ignored, like an awkward decoration they didn't want in the main frame. We sat at the far end of the family table while Marin and Kane were positioned near the head like royalty. That's how my family does hierarchy. Not with signs, not with announcements, but with placements. Who gets the best view? Who gets served first? Who gets asked questions? Who gets praised? Who gets joked about? Dinner started with speeches and toasts, the kind of speeches that sound good on video but mean nothing in real life. My father stood and talked about commitment like he hadn't spent decades rewarding cruelty with silence. My mother dabbed at tears like she was auditioning for sympathy. Relatives I barely know smiled and raised glasses and said words like legacy and blessing and inspiration, and I sipped water and watched Lila's shoulders tighten every time someone laughed too loud. I leaned close and asked, "You okay?" She nodded, but her eyes didn't. Across the table, Kane was already acting like he ran the place. He complained about his food, he snapped at a server, he knocked over a glass and didn't even blink, and Marin watched him with pride, like raising a little tyrant was an achievement. And then it happened, fast and casual, like he'd done it 100 times. Kane snapped his fingers at Lila. Not at me, not at the server, at my child. He snapped, pointed at his empty cup, and said, "Get me more." Lila froze. I felt that hot rush behind my eyes, that instant parent fury that tastes metallic, and I opened my mouth to shut it down, but Marin leaned forward first with that syrupy smile. "Go on, Lila," she said, sweet as poison. "Help your cousin." The table didn't go silent, but it got tense, that tense quiet where everyone hears everything and pretends they didn't. Lila looked at me, and you could see her thinking, because kids and families like ours don't think in terms of right and wrong first, they think in terms of consequences. What happens if I say yes? What happens if I say no? Who's going to protect me if it goes wrong? I wanted to tell her, "Stay seated, you don't serve anybody," and then my mother glanced over with that warning look she's perfected, the look that says, "Don't embarrass me. Not tonight. Not in front of people. Don't disrupt the performance." And in that split-second hesitation, Kane snapped again, louder. "And a napkin," he said. "Clean. Not the used kind." Marin laughed like it was cute. "He has standards," she announced, proud. "I taught him that." "Taught him what?" "Exactly. To treat people like staff. To treat women like service? To treat a child like a maid?" Now I want you to pause right here and tell me what you would have done, because I know half the comments are going to say, "I would have stood up immediately," and the other half are going to say, "It's family, you keep the peace." And I need to know which side you're on, because that choice, that exact moment, is where the whole story splits. Lila's hands curled under the table, and then, quietly, so quietly you almost miss it unless you're watching her mouth, she said, "No, one word. Clean. Calm. Not disrespectful. Not loud. Not dramatic. Just a boundary." And that one word hit the room like someone dropped a plate. Kane blinked like he couldn't process it. Marin's smile flickered. "What did you say?" she asked, still pretending sweetness, but her voice changed. Lila lifted her chin just a fraction. "I said no. He can get it himself." And then the air changed. You know that feeling when a room goes from warm to cold without the temperature moving? That. Marin stood slowly, deliberately, chair scraping the floor, and people turned to watch like it was entertainment. My father's eyes moved, but his body didn't. My mother's lips tightened, but she stayed seated. Marin leaned in toward Lila with that calm, controlled tone people use when they're about to justify something ugly. "You don't talk to my son like that," she said. Lila, God bless her, didn't flinch. "I didn't talk to him like anything," she said. "I said no." And then Marin's hand went to her waist. She started removing her belt. Not in a chaotic rage. Not out of control. Slow. Methodical. Like a ceremony. Like she believed she had permission. Like she was about to make an example. And that's when my body finally caught up to what my brain already knew, that this wasn't about juice. This was about dominance. This was about Marin needing everyone to see that her child can command mine, and no one will stop it. I pushed back my chair, half standing, but people were blocking the aisle, and my mother made a small noise. Not stop, not don't, but that panic social noise people make when they care more about what it looks like than what it is. And I want to ask you something right here, and be honest with yourself. How many times have you watched a wrong thing happen in your family and stayed seated because you didn't want to cause drama? Because I did it for years, and it's the kind of guilt that doesn't go away, it just changes shape. Before I tell you what happened next, I want you to drop where you're watching from because I read those comments and I swear it reminds you that you're not crazy for feeling what you feel. So tell me, are you watching from Texas, Florida, California, New York, somewhere in the Midwest, or are you outside the US? Put your city or state down there for me. And while you're typing that, picture this. 50 guests, a fancy room, everyone dressed up, a child standing her ground for the first time, and then a grown woman deciding discipline is her right even when the child is not hers. Marin lifted the belt, and I moved, and the room tightened, and then the first strike came down. Lila jerked back, instinctive, hands up, and the second strike landed as she tried to shield herself, and then I heard a sound that did not belong in a celebration. A sickening crack that made every head turn and every mouth open, and Lila screamed. Not a tantrum scream, not a brat scream, the kind of scream that empties a room of its lies. Her arm fell at an angle that made my stomach drop. My mother's hand flew to her mouth. My father finally stood, but still didn't move toward her. Marin stood there breathing hard, belt still in her hand, face flushed, not with shame, with indignation, like she'd been insulted. She needed to learn, she said, shaking. Kids need to learn their place. And that, right there, was the line that snapped something inside me, because when someone says place, they're admitting the whole system is rigged. Love in my family had always been conditional, and obedience was the currency, and my child just refused to pay. I didn't yell. I didn't perform. I stepped in, scooped Lila up carefully, careful like she was glass, and I felt her shaking against me, her breath ragged, and I looked around the table at 50 faces that had just watched a grown woman hurt a child and did nothing, and I realized something so clear it felt like a light turning on. In this family, silence is not neutrality. Silence is permission. I carried Lila out of that room, past the cake that looked like art, past the flowers, past the gold chairs, past the people who would later call it a misunderstanding, and I walked into the parking lot where the air felt too thin, and I put her in the car, and her tears soaked my sleeve, and my hands were steady even though my heart was beating like a drum. And as I turned the key in the ignition, I made a promise, so quiet it was almost a prayer. This will not be buried. This will not be rewritten, and this time, nobody gets to call it an accident. And then my phone started buzzing before I even left the parking lot, because the moment you refuse to protect a family's image, they all become very interested in talking, and I glanced at the screen and saw my mother's name, my father's name, and Marin's name back to back, and I realized the real fight was about to begin, not in that fancy room, but in the story they were already trying to tell about what happened. My phone started buzzing before I even backed out of the parking spot, and I didn't answer because I already knew what the first words would be. Not is Lila okay? Not where are you? But don't make this a big thing, because that's the family religion. Protect the image, sacrifice the truth. And I drove with one hand on the wheel and the other hovering near my daughter's castless, swelling arm like I could hold the bone together by willpower alone. And Lila was crying in that quiet, exhausted way where the tears just keep coming because the body doesn't know where to put the shock, and she kept whispering, "Mom, I didn't do anything." And I kept saying, "I know," over and over, like repetition could anchor her. And as we pulled onto the main road, the venue lights fell behind us, and I realized something terrifying. The danger wasn't just what Marin did. The danger was what everyone allowed. Because when an entire room watches a child get hurt and nobody moves, it teaches a lesson louder than any belt ever could. It teaches the child that grown-ups will not save you unless one of them decides you're worth the inconvenience. The emergency room smelled like disinfectant and old coffee, those harsh overhead lights that make everyone look guilty, and the waiting area was full of people whose problems had nothing to do with us, which felt like a relief because nobody there knew our family, nobody there cared about our last name, nobody there was invested in spinning this into a misunderstanding. A nurse with kind eyes asked Lila what happened, and Lila tried to speak, but her lips trembled, so I said it, plain and steady. My sister hit her, and you could see the nurse's face change. Not dramatic, just a professional shift into seriousness, and she said, "Okay, we're going to take care of you." And they got Lila into a wheelchair, and I followed behind holding her little blue purse like it still mattered, like it still contained normal life, and the X-ray tech was gentle, telling Lila exactly what she was doing before she did it. And I watched my child grit her teeth and try not to scream again, and I hated myself for that split second at the table when I hesitated, because parents always replay the moment right before the fall, the moment you could have changed it, the moment your brain wanted to obey the old rules and keep the peace. And then the doctor came in with that careful neutral face, the one that means the truth is going to land heavy no matter how softly they say it, and she explained the fracture, where it was, how they'd set it, what the healing timeline looked like, and then she asked the question everyone asks when they see a child with an injury that doesn't match a playground accident. "Can you tell me exactly how this happened?" And I looked her in the eye and said, "My sister removed her belt and hit my daughter in front of a room full of witnesses." And for the first time that night, I saw an adult response that made sense. The doctor nodded. Not judging, not doubting, and she said, "We have to file a report." And I said, "I know," because somewhere under the rage there was a cold clarity rising, the kind that makes you useful, the kind that makes you dangerous to people who rely on your silence. They set Lila's arm, and the relief on her face after the pain meds kicked in almost broke me, because she relaxed. Just a little, like her body finally believed it could stop bracing, and she fell asleep in that hospital bed with her mouth slightly open and her eyelashes wet. And I sat there staring at the wall while my phone kept buzzing like a trapped fly, and at some point I finally looked at it, and the messages were exactly what you think they were. Not concern, not accountability, but damage control. My mother texting, "Please come back so we can talk," as if the location of the conversation mattered more than the broken bone. My father saying, "Your sister didn't mean for it to go that far," as if intention rewinds time. My brother-in-law sending, "Let's handle this privately," which is code for "let us bury it." And then Marin herself, bold as ever, sending, "She disrespected my son in front of everyone. What did you expect me to do?" And I stared at that sentence so long my eyes started to burn, because it wasn't even denial, it was entitlement. She genuinely believed she had the right to punish my child for protecting herself from being treated like a servant. We got home after midnight, and I carried Lila inside, her cast heavy and bright against her small arm, and she drifted in and out of sleep, and I laid her down carefully, propping her arm on pillows, checking her fingers for warmth and color like the nurse showed me. And then I sat at my kitchen table and did something I never thought I'd do to my own family. I opened my laptop, and I started building a case. Not because I'm petty, not because I'm vindictive, because I'm a mother, and I've seen how stories get rewritten in families like mine, how a broken bone becomes a fall, how a beating becomes a little spanking, how a child's scream becomes drama, and I was not going to let my daughter grow up inside a lie. I opened a blank document, and I typed the date, the time, the venue name, the seating arrangement, who was at the table, who was within view, what Kane said, what Marin said, what my mother did with her face, what my father did with his hands, and I wrote it all down while it was still fresh, because memory gets attacked first. That's the first battlefield. They'll tell you it didn't happen like that. They'll tell you you're exaggerating. They'll tell you you were emotional. And if you don't have notes, if you don't have details, they'll try to drown the truth in fog. Then I made a folder on my computer called Evidence, and I screenshot every text message, every voicemail notification, every attempt to minimize, every sentence that implied my daughter's pain was less important than their reputation. And then I scrolled through my camera roll, and I found the picture I snapped in the ER of Lila's cast, not for social media, not for sympathy, but for proof. And I saved it twice. Cloud and hard drive, because I was done trusting family to do the right thing. By morning the narrative had already been poisoned, Because that's what people like Marin do. They don't just hurt you. They race to control the story about the hurting, and I woke up to a family group chat I hadn't used in months, full of chirpy messages that made my blood run cold. So sorry to hear about the accident. Hope Lila feels better. Big events can be chaotic, and the word accident sat there like a thumb in my eye. Accident is what happens when you trip. Accident is what happens when a glass breaks. Accident is not a grown woman taking off a belt and swinging until a child's arm fractures. I scrolled up and found Marin's message at the top, the one that had set the tone. Last night got out of hand. There was a disagreement. Lila had a little accident. She's fine. Just wanted everyone to know before rumors start. And that's when the cold clarity hardened into something sharper, because she wasn't just lying. She was recruiting. She was building a chorus. She was testing who would sing along. I didn't respond in the group chat. I called one person I thought might still have a conscience, my cousin Denise, who'd been sitting a few seats away and had that startled face right after it happened, and when she answered, her voice sounded careful, like she'd already been coached, and I said, "How's your memory today, Denise?" And she exhaled like she knew exactly why I was calling, and I said, "Tell me what you saw," and she hesitated, and I cut through it. "Not what you heard, not what they texted you, what you saw with your own eyes." And then she said it quietly. Marin hit her. And I said, "How many times?" And she whispered, "More than once." And I said, "Did you hear the sound?" And she started crying and said, "Yes." And I let that silence it, because I needed her to feel the weight of what she witnessed. And then I asked, "If someone official calls you, will you tell the truth?" And she said, "Yes." Like she was saying it to save her own soul. And then I made 2 more calls, and one person confirmed, and one person tried to dodge, and my uncle actually said, "You're going too far," and hung up, and I wrote his name down too, because that's information as well. And then something happened that none of them expected. Not Marin, not my parents, not the relatives who love peace more than justice. The consequences started moving faster than the gossip, because hospitals don't care about your family status, and mandated reporters don't wait for your mother to craft a statement. And within days there were knocks on doors, questions asked in firm voices, uncomfortable pauses where people realized they couldn't smile their way out of a fractured bone. And my mother called screaming, "What did you do?" Like I'd set the fire instead of putting it out, and my father texted, "You're tearing the family apart." And I stared at that line and thought, no, the family tore itself apart when it decided a child's place mattered more than her safety. I sat beside Lila on the couch that evening, her cast propped up, her face pale from exhaustion, and she asked in this small voice that still makes my chest tighten, "Am I in trouble?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Is Aunt Marin mad?" And I said, "Yes, and she can stay mad." And then she looked at me like she was trying to understand a new rule, a rule where no is allowed, and she whispered, "Are you scared?" And I realized my whole life I'd been trained to be scared of my family's anger. But in that moment, I wasn't scared of them anymore. I was scared of what happens to children when nobody fights for them, and I told her the truth. "Not anymore." And she nodded like she liked that answer, and my phone buzzed again and again and again, and I didn't pick up because I was already past the part where they talked me into silence. And the next morning, when my lawyer called and said, "We can file the restraining order today," I looked at Lila's cast, I looked at her sleeping face, and I felt something settle in place, the kind of calm you get right before a storm you didn't start but you're finally willing to finish. And I said, "File it." And then the lawyer paused and asked, "Are you ready for what they're going to do when they realize you're not backing down?" And I said, "I've been backing down my whole life." And then I heard my front doorbell ring, not a friendly ring, not a casual drop-by ring, the kind of ring that carries a message. And when I opened the door and saw who was standing there, my stomach dropped, because Marin hadn't come alone. I opened the door, and there she was. My sister Marin in heels like this was still her stage. her mouth already curled into that little half smile that means she thinks she's about to win. And beside her was my mother with that frozen polite face she uses when she's about to pretend something ugly is family business. And behind them my father stood angled like a bouncer, not to protect me, but to control the conversation. And the first thing I noticed was what they didn't bring. They didn't bring flowers. They didn't bring an apology. They didn't bring concern for Lila. They brought an audience and an agenda, and Marin spoke first like she owned my porch. We need to handle this. And she said it the same way people say, we need to handle your attitude. And I didn't move. I didn't invite them in. I just held the doorframe and asked, handle what? And my mother immediately did that soft, fake, soothing tone. Honey, we're all upset, but calling lawyers and filing reports is extreme. And I swear to you, I almost laughed, because in my family, a child's broken arm is a situation, but accountability is extreme. And then my father cleared his throat and said, let's not do this on the porch, which is code for let's not let the neighbors hear what kind of people we are. And I said, you should have worried about public embarrassment before you watched my daughter get hit. And Marin's smile slid off her face, and she stepped closer and lowered her voice like she was about to confide something sacred. She disrespected my son, and I felt that familiar family hypnosis try to creep in, the one where you start weighing a child's dignity against an adult's pride like it's a reasonable trade, and I snapped out of it so fast it almost surprised me, and I said, your son is 11, and he snapped his fingers at my child like she was a waitress. He demanded a drink, a napkin, a clean fork, and you sat there smiling like you raised royalty. And Marin's eyes flashed and she hissed, you've always been jealous. And there it was, the classic move. When they can't justify what they did, they attack who you are, and my mother jumped in like a referee who's already picked a winner. Don't escalate. Your sister didn't intend to hurt her. And I looked at my mother's face and I said, Mom. She took off a belt, and my mother blinked like she didn't want to picture it, and I said slower. She took off a belt and swung it multiple times, and my child's bone broke. That isn't an accident, that's a choice. And my father tried to cut in. You're making this sound worse than it was. And I felt my throat tighten because that sentence right there is why kids grow up confused and adults grow up cruel. Because if you can shrink reality with words, you can avoid responsibility with ease. And I leaned forward just enough for him to see I wasn't playing. And I said, worse than it was would be if she'd lost a tooth. Worse than it would be if she hit her head. Worse than it would be if I wasn't strong enough to walk out and protect her. Don't ever tell me a broken bone isn't bad enough. And then Marin did something that made my skin crawl. She tilted her head and said, where is she? Not, how is she? Not, can I apologize? Just, where is she? Like, she wanted access. Like, she wanted to finish the control she started, and I said, not here for you. And my mother sighed like I was the one being unreasonable, and she said, let's all calm down. Lila needs family right now. And I said, Lila needs safety right now, and family failed that test in front of 50 witnesses. And my father's face hardened, and he said, so you're really going to do this? You're really going to drag us through court? And I said, I'm not dragging you anywhere. Your choices are walking you there. And then Marin snapped, full mask off, and she said, your kid needed discipline. And my stomach turned, because there are some sentences that tell you a person is not confused, not mistaken, but dangerous. And I said, discipline doesn't fracture bones. And she rolled her eyes like I was dramatic, and she said, kids these days think they can say no to adults. And I stared at her, and I thought, imagine saying that out loud and thinking you're the hero. And I said, yes, kids can say no. And then I pointed at my mother and father. And the reason you're all panicking isn't because you feel guilty. It's because the outside world finally saw what you've been hiding. And my mother's eyes watered instantly, not with empathy, but with fear, and she whispered, do you know how this looks? And that sentence again, not is she okay, but how does it look? And I asked you because I need you in this with me. If your parents watched your child get hurt and their first panic was their reputation, would you still call that love? or would you call it what it is? A contract where you only get dignity if you stay quiet. And then my father stepped closer, shoulders squared, and he said, "You're not thinking clearly, you're emotional." And that's when I felt something flip, because that word emotional is the oldest gag in the book. It's the way they turn a mother's protective instincts into hysteria. And I said, "I'm thinking clearer than I have in my entire life." And then I closed the door, not a slam, just a firm close, and I locked it. And through the glass, I saw my mother's mouth open like she couldn't believe I'd chosen my child over their access, and Marin shouted, "You can't shut us out." And I said through the door, "Watch me." And I walked back to the couch where Lila was half asleep, her cast resting on pillows, and she opened one eye and whispered, "Was that Aunt Marin?" And I said, "Yes," and she flinched just a tiny bit, and my heart cracked, because that flinch is the real injury, not the bone, the trust. And I sat beside her, and I said, "You're safe." And she asked, "Is she going to be mad forever?" And I told her the truth in the gentlest way I could. She might be, and that's not your problem. And then my phone rang and my lawyer's name lit up the screen, and she said, "They showed up at your house, didn't they?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Okay, listen carefully. You cannot meet them alone again. And we're filing the emergency protective order today." And I felt my hands steady as if my body was relieved someone professional was finally saying what my family never did, that this was serious. And then she added, "Also, the hospital report triggered a CPS intake. They're going to contact you." And for a split second, my stomach dropped, because the words Child Protective Services can scare any good parent even when you've done nothing wrong. And I said, "But I'm not the one who hurt her." And my lawyer said, "I know, and that's why you document everything and you stay calm." And then the next call came in, and it was a number I didn't recognize. And when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Hi, this is Miss Carter. I'm a caseworker. I need to ask you a few questions about the incident." And as she spoke, I looked at Lila and realized the next battle wasn't just legal. It was narrative, because Marin and my parents were going to try to paint me as unstable, overreactive, the kind of mother who causes drama, and I could already hear them saying it. And then Miss Carter asked, "Do you have a safe place for your child?" And I said, "Yes." And she said, "Do you believe your sister is a danger to your child?" And I paused, because saying yes out loud makes it real in a way your stomach never forgets. And then I said, "Yes," and I meant it. And when that call ended, my phone buzzed again with a new message in the family group chat, and it was my mother, writing to everyone like she was hosting a PR campaign. "Please pray for our family. There was a misunderstanding. Emotions ran high. We're asking for privacy." And I stared at it and felt my pulse rise, because now I knew their plan: minimize, spiritualize, guilt trip, and isolate me. And then another message popped up from my uncle. "Why are you doing this to your parents?" And I sat there looking at my child's cast, and I thought, because nobody asked why they did this to my child. And then I opened my laptop again, and I started drafting a timeline so detailed it would make it impossible for them to wiggle. And as I typed, there was a knock at my door again, not the aggressive doorbell ring this time, a knock that sounded official, measured. And when I looked through the peephole, my throat went tight, because standing there was a uniformed officer holding a notepad, and beside him was Marin's husband, Kane, and his face looked like a man who had decided he was not going down with her ship. I opened the door just enough to keep the chain on, because when you've spent your whole life being trained to be nice to people who hurt you, you learn the hard way that politeness can get you killed. And the officer introduced himself in that calm, practiced way, like he'd done this 1,000 times, and beside him stood Kane, my brother-in-law, hands shoved in his pockets, eyes darting everywhere except at me. And that right there told me something important. He wasn't here to defend me, he was here to save himself. And the officer said, "Ma'am, we're following up on an incident reported by the hospital." And the way he said hospital made my stomach twist, because my parents kept calling it a family argument, like it was adults being dramatic. But the hospital doesn't deal in opinions. The hospital deals in bones. And I nodded and said, she's inside. And he asked, is your daughter safe right now? And I said, yes. And Kane cleared his throat like he wanted to hurry this along. And he said, look, I'm not here to fight. I just want us to be handled. And I looked at him and said, handle like you handled it at the party. And he flinched because he knew exactly what I meant. The way he stood there like a statue while my kid got hit, and the officer asked to speak to me privately, and I stepped onto the porch and pulled the door closed behind me, and Kane stayed back a few feet, not out of respect, but because he didn't want to be recorded saying something stupid. And the officer said, did your sister strike your daughter with a belt? And I said, yes. And he asked, how many times? And I said, at least 3, maybe more, and the 3rd strike is when her arm broke. And I hate that I can describe it so clearly, but trauma gives you perfect memory. And then he asked, were there witnesses? And I said, 50. And I watched his eyes narrow slightly, like even he couldn't believe that number, and I added, and my parents were right there, and nobody stopped it. And I needed you to understand the kind of sickness that is, the kind of sickness where a room full of adults decides a child's pain is less important than keeping the vibe pleasant. And then the officer turned his head toward Kane and asked, sir, were you present? And Kane nodded, and the officer asked, did you see the assault? And Kane paused just long enough to remind me how cowardice looks, and he said, I saw an incident. And I almost laughed because that's the language people use when they want to sound innocent. An incident, like the belt floated through the air by itself. And I said, you saw my daughter get beaten. And Kane's face tightened and he said, Marin lost control. And there it was, the first attempt at rewriting, making it sound like it was a momentary lapse, not a pattern, not a worldview, not a woman who believes children exist to serve her son. And the officer asked, has there been prior behavior like this? And I hesitated because here's the truth I didn't want to admit out loud. My sister's always been like this. She just usually chooses targets who can't fight back, and my parents have always covered for her because they love the image of family unity more than they love actual human beings. And I said, she's been controlling and cruel for years, and my parents enable her, and my daughter has been singled out before. And the officer nodded slowly. Then he said the sentence that made my blood run cold. Sir, your wife indicated the child was being disrespectful and that she acted as a guardian. And I looked at Kane and my voice dropped. She told you that. And Kane didn't answer because silence is an answer. And it hit me like a slap. Marin had already started spinning the story to law enforcement like she was some brave disciplinarian saving society for my bad child. And I said to the officer, my child said no to being treated like a servant. That's it. That's the crime. And I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears. And then the officer asked if he could see the injury. And I said, only if you're gentle. And I went inside, and my daughter was on the couch with her cast propped up, eyes wide. And when she saw the uniform, her body stiffened. Not because she did anything wrong, but because kids learn fast that authority doesn't always protect them. Sometimes authority protects the people with money and confidence. And I sat beside her and said softly, this is Officer Reynolds. He's here because what happened to you matters. And I watched her swallow, and the officer knelt down so he wasn't towering over her, and he said, hi, sweetheart. I'm sorry you're going through this. Can you tell me what happened in your own words? And she glanced at me, and I nodded, and she whispered, he snapped his fingers at me. And the officer said, who is he? And she said, my cousin, and my aunt said I had to do what he said. And she paused, and I could see her trying to decide if telling the truth would get her in trouble, and she said, and I said no. And the officer said, and then, and my daughter's voice got smaller. And then my aunt hit me, and she raised her cast a little like it was proof, and the officer's jaw flexed, and he asked, did she hit you once or more than once? And my daughter looked down and said, more. And my stomach clenched because I hated that she had to answer that question like she was in court at 12 years old. And then Kane spoke up from the doorway, trying to sound reasonable. Look, she didn't mean to break her arm. And I turned on him so fast I surprised myself and I said, "Stop." And he blinked and I said, "Stop defending it. Stop minimizing it. Stop acting like intent erases impact. If I swing a bat at your head and miss your skull by an inch, do you want credit for what I didn't do?" And Kane's face flushed and he looked away. And the officer stood and said, "Ma'am, we'll be filing a report and you may be contacted by a social worker." And I said, "I already was." And I could tell he respected that I wasn't hiding because abusers hide, protective parents document. And after he left, Kane lingered like he wanted to have his own little conversation. And he said quietly, "You know Marin's going to come for you, right?" And I stared at him and said, "She already did." And he exhaled through his nose and said, "My wife is intense. Like that's what you call violence when you're afraid of the word violent." And I said, "Is she intense or is she abusive?" And Kane's eyes flicked up and then away again, and he said, "If you keep pushing this, it'll get ugly." And I almost thanked him for finally telling the truth, because at least he wasn't pretending anymore, and I said, "It's already ugly. You just liked it better when it was ugly for my child and comfortable for you." And that landed. I saw it land, because his shoulders dropped just a little, like guilt finally found him, and then he said, "Marin thinks you're trying to humiliate her." And I said, "No." Marin humiliated herself the moment she decided her son's ego was more important than a little girl's body. And he swallowed and said, "Your parents are freaking out." And I laughed once, short and bitter, and I said, "Of course they are, because this time they can't smooth it over with a group text and a fake prayer request." And then Kane said something that made my skin crawl. He said, "They're telling people your daughter swung first." And my entire body went hot, like rage lit under my ribs, and I said, "Excuse me?" And he nodded. "They're saying she mouthed off through a utensil, that Marin had to step in." And I stared at him and I said, "So they're lying," and he didn't deny it. And that was the moment I understood the real fight wasn't just with Marin, it was with the whole family machine that protects the loudest bully and sacrifices the quietest child. And I asked you, because I want you to answer in your head right now, if you heard a family was telling strangers a 12-year-old deserved a broken arm, would you call that love? Or would you call it what it is, a cover-up? And then I thanked Kane for the information, not because he deserved kindness, but because I wanted him talking, and he hesitated at the steps like he was choosing between loyalty and self-preservation, and finally he said, "If it goes to court, I'll tell what I saw." And I looked at him and said, "Don't tell what you saw, tell what you did, which was nothing." And he flinched, and then he left. And the second the door closed, I grabbed my phone and opened the family group chat. And there it was, a flood of messages. My mother calling it a misunderstanding. My father saying we can't let outsiders destroy the family. My sister typing like a queen issuing decrees. "You will regret this." And then one message from my mother that made me physically shake. "If you keep this up, you'll lose everyone." And I stared at it and thought, good. Because anyone who sees a child's broken arm as a negotiation tactic is not someone I want in my life. And I screenshotted it and dropped it into my evidence folder. And then I got on the phone with my lawyer again, and she said, "Okay, here's what happens next. Emergency restraining order, witness affidavits, and we request the security footage from the venue." And my heart thumped. "There's footage." And she said, "Most banquet halls have cameras, and if they do, it's the difference between he said, she said, and the truth." And I sat down hard because I suddenly pictured it. Marin in a fancy dress taking off a belt like it was normal. My parents watching like statues. The guests frozen. My daughter's body flinching. And I realized the family's biggest fear wasn't jail. It was proof. And as if on cue, my phone buzzed again, a private number this time, and when I answered, a woman's voice said, "Hi, my name is Denise. I was at the party, and I need to tell you something because what I saw didn't sit right with me." and your mother is calling people right now trying to get us all on the same story." Denise's voice was shaky but determined, like a person who finally got tired of being polite about evil, and I stepped into the hallway so Mila wouldn't hear the next part because kids don't need front row seats to adult cowardice, and I said, "Denise, tell me everything. Start from where you were sitting." And she exhaled and said, "I was at table 7, near the dance floor. I had a clear view of your family table because your sister kept standing up like she owned the room." And then she paused and I could hear her swallow, and she said, "Your mother approached me right after you left and she told me, if anyone asks, it was a misunderstanding. The girls were playing and the child fell." And the way she said child made my stomach flip because my daughter has a name, and people only strip names away when they're trying to make a victim sound less human. And I said, "My mother said that." And Denise said, "Yes." And then she walked over to 2 other guests and said the same thing, like she was passing out party favors, and I leaned my forehead against the wall for a second because I could literally see it. My mom in her best outfit doing damage control like a politician, and I asked, "Did anyone agree?" And Denise hesitated and said, some nodded, some looked uncomfortable, but nobody wanted to be the first person to say, that was abuse. Because it was a fancy party and people are weird about fancy, and I felt my hands tighten around the phone, and I said, "Denise, did you see Marin hit my daughter?" And she went quiet for a beat, and then she said, "Yes, I saw it, and it wasn't a snap decision. She took her time. She unbuckled the belt. She folded it in half like she knew what she was doing, and then she swung it, and your father stood up, but he didn't step in. He just stood there like he was watching a show he didn't want to ruin." And I closed my eyes because that image made me furious in a way I don't even have a clean word for, and Denise kept going. "And your sister's son," he smirked like it was entertaining, like he learned that power means other people suffer, and you get applauded for it. And I whispered, Mila screamed, and Denise said, "I know, that's the thing, when your daughter screamed it changed the whole room. You could feel it like a record scratch, and then people looked at each other like, are we supposed to react?" And nobody did. And then you picked her up and walked out, and I swear to you, half the room looked relieved you left, like your pain leaving meant they could go back to eating cake. And I felt the sting behind my eyes, not tears yet, just pressure. Because the truth is sometimes strangers show you more humanity than your own blood. And I said, "Denise, if my lawyer calls you, will you tell this exact story?" And she answered fast, "Yes, I will, because your mother called it an accident, and it was not an accident. And I have a granddaughter too, and if anyone ever did that to her, I'd burn the whole place down." And I almost laughed because the bluntness was so refreshing, and I said, "Thank you," and she added, "And there's something else." And my heart did that small drop it does when you know another shoe is coming, and she said, "I overheard your sister talking near the bar after you left." She said, "If she thinks she can run her mouth, I'll take her kid from her." And I went cold, like ice poured into my ribs, and I said, "She said she'll take my kid." And Denise said, "Those exact words," and your mother said, "We'll handle it," like they already had a plan. And my mind started sprinting because abusers don't just hit, they also threaten systems, they weaponize paperwork, they weaponize reputation, they weaponize the fact that people believe a well-dressed liar over a traumatized mom. And I asked Denise, "Do you know if anyone recorded it?" And she said, "I don't know, but the venue has cameras." And I saw one pointed right at the family table, and I said, "Okay, that's enough. Thank you, and please don't mention this to them." And she said, "I won't." And then she lowered her voice and said, "Be careful. Your mother is calling people, and your sister's the type who smiles while she sharpens a knife." And I hung up and stood there in the quiet hallway, and it hit me that this wasn't going to be a simple legal situation. This was going to be a social war too, the kind where they try to make you look unstable so they can keep control. And I walked back into the living room, and Mila looked up at me with that expression kids have when they're trying to be brave for their parent. And I sat beside her and I said, "How's your arm feeling?" And she shrugged and said, "It's okay. which is kid language for it hurts, but I don't want to be a problem. And I felt my throat tighten because that's the part that will haunt me forever. My daughter thinking she's a problem when she was the one attacked. And I said, "Listen to me. You are not the problem. You never were." And she stared at the cast and said, "Are we going to see them again?" And I didn't lie to her. I said, "Not if you don't want to." And she whispered, "I don't." And I nodded and said, "Okay, then we won't." And then my phone started buzzing again like a swarm, and I didn't even look because I already knew it would be the same script, the same gaslighting, the same keep the peace nonsense. And I want you to think about this for a second because I need you to judge it with your whole chest. If a grown woman breaks a child's arm, and the family's first instinct is to coordinate a story, who are they protecting, the child or the abuser? And that question right there is the difference between a family and a cult, because healthy families protect the vulnerable, unhealthy families protect the image. And I opened my laptop again and started a new page titled Narrative Control, and I wrote down exactly what Denise said my mother was telling people. Accident, misunderstanding, fell. And then I opened my folder and created a subfolder called Witnesses, and I added Denise's name, her phone number, what table she was at, what she saw, and then I went back to my screenshots and found my mother's text, "Don't involve outsiders," and I starred it because let me tell you something, "Don't involve outsiders" is code for let us keep hurting you privately. And then I did the thing I didn't want to do, but had to. I called the venue, and I spoke to the manager in a voice that sounded calm even though my hands were shaking, and I said, "I need to preserve any security footage from Saturday night between 7:30 and 9:30. There was an assault on a minor," and the manager's tone changed instantly, from customer service bright to legal cautious, and he said, "Ma'am, I'm sorry to hear that. We can't release footage without a subpoena, but we can preserve it." And I said, "Preserve it now, please." And he said, "Consider it done." And I hung up and exhaled, because that was one of those small moments where you feel power come back into your body, not because you're strong, but because you're acting, and action is the antidote to helplessness. And then, as if my family's mess had a schedule, a new message popped up from an unknown number, just one line: "You're going to lose your daughter if you keep this up." And my fingers went numb because only two types of people send that kind of text: someone trying to scare you into silence, or someone setting up a future accusation. And I stared at it and took a screenshot and saved it, and then I forwarded it to my lawyer, and within 5 minutes she replied, "Do not respond, we will trace this." And I sat back and realized something terrifying and clarifying at the same time. They weren't just sorry and embarrassed, they were dangerous. And my mind went straight back to the moment at the party when my sister said, "Children need to learn their place." Because that wasn't just a cruel sentence, that was a philosophy, and people with that philosophy don't stop until they're forced. And I looked at Mila, her face softer now as she watched some silly show, and I felt the rage shift into something colder and more focused. And I thought, you tried to make my child small. You tried to mark her as a servant. You tried to teach her that no gets punished, and now you're going to learn what no looks like when it comes from a mother who's done being quiet. And then the doorbell rang, sharp and sudden, and my body tensed, because it was late, and nobody normal shows up late unless it's important or it's trouble. And I walked to the door and looked through the peephole, and my heart kicked hard, because standing there was my mother, and beside her was my father, and behind them, half hidden like a shadow, was Marin, holding something in her hand that looked a lot like paperwork. I didn't open the door right away because the peephole doesn't lie, and what I saw was a trio that only shows up when they think they still run your life. My mother with that tight, polite face she uses when she's about to pretend she's the victim. My father standing slightly behind her like a bouncer for her delusion, and Marin in the back holding a manila envelope like it was a weapon. And I want you to picture this clearly, because this is the moment they count on your nerves, your guilt, your conditioning. They count on you being the version of yourself that always says, okay, just to stop the tension. And my hand was on the doorknob, and I could feel my heart punching my ribs, not because I was scared of them physically, but because I knew what they were, a coordinated machine. And machines don't come to talk, they come to force outcomes. And behind me, Mila's show was still playing with those laugh tracks that sound like a room full of people who don't have problems. And I thought, my daughter deserves that room, not the one they keep dragging us into. So I stepped away from the door, took one slow breath, and I called my lawyer on speaker. Just the act of doing that made my spine straighten. And when she answered, I said quietly, "They're at my door." And she didn't ask who, she already knew, and she said, "Do not open. If you want to communicate, do it through the door, keep it calm, and record." And I hit record on my phone, held it at my side, walked back to the door, and spoke through it without unlocking a thing. "What do you want?" And my mother's voice instantly softened like honey poured over glass. "Sweetheart, we just want to talk. Your father and I are here to make sure things don't get misunderstood." And that word misunderstood almost made me laugh, because a broken arm is not a misunderstanding. It's math, it's force, it's impact. It's an X-ray that doesn't care about your family narrative. And I said, "There's nothing to talk about." And my father's voice cut in, low and annoyed. "Open the door. We're your parents." And I said, "Being my parents didn't stop you from sitting there while my child was beaten, so no." And there was a pause, and then Marin's voice slid through the crack in the door like a knife. "You're being dramatic, and I want you to hear how crazy that is. A grown woman fractures a child's arm and calls the mother dramatic. And if you've ever had a family like this, you know exactly what they do. They injure you, and then they critique your reaction to the injury, like you're the problem for bleeding." And my mother sighed loud enough for me to hear it through the door, like she was suffering, and she said, "We're not here to fight. We're here to keep this private. It will ruin everyone's life if you keep pushing." And I said, "You mean it will ruin your life?" And she snapped back, "Don't twist my words." And that was the real her. There it is. The mask slipping the moment you don't cooperate. And then my father said, "Your sister has paperwork. She's willing to forgive you if you stop." And I almost choked, because listen, forgive me. Forgive me for what? For not offering my daughter up like a servant. For not pretending my daughter's pain is a minor inconvenience. For refusing to let them label my child as property. And I said, "If you're here to threaten me, know this is recorded." And then you could hear them shuffle, like that little statement reminded them the world exists outside their bubble. And Marin said, "Fine. Since you want to be like that, we're serving you notice." And she slid the manila envelope down toward the doormat like she was handing off a pizza, and my mother added quickly, "It's just something our attorney advised. It's standard." Standard, my foot. Standard is what people say when they're trying to make something evil sound normal. And I didn't open the door. I didn't touch the envelope. I stepped back and asked through the door, "What is it?" And Marin said with this smug little laugh, "A family complaint and a request for an emergency custody review, because clearly you're unstable and you're creating danger for Mila by escalating conflict." And my stomach flipped, not because it was credible, but because it was predictable. This is what abusers do when they get caught. They run to systems and try to flip the script. They try to make the protector look like the threat, and my mother layered it on like frosting. "We're worried about her. You've been emotional. You're isolating her, and we think it's best Mila stays with family while you calm down. And I need you to pause and really judge this with your whole soul, because did you catch it? They broke her arm, and then they tried to take her away from the one person who protected her. That's not love. That's control." And my father said, "Just open the door so we can discuss this like adults." And I said, "Adults don't break children's bones and then file papers to silence the mother." And then Marin snapped, "You're making this sound worse than it was." And I said, "My daughter's arm snapped. What part of that is smaller?" And there was silence. And in that silence, I could hear Mila in the living room laugh at something on TV, and it made me angrier and calmer at the same time, because it reminded me what I was protecting. Not my pride, not revenge, not drama. I was protecting her childhood, her sense of safety, her right to say no without being punished. And I told them through the door, "Leave now. Any future communication goes through my attorney." And my mother's voice turned icy. "You think you can talk to us like that?" And I said, I can talk to anyone like that when my child's safety is involved. And then my father raised his voice. You are tearing this family apart. And I said, no, you tore it apart the moment you chose silence over your granddaughter. And then the part that really showed me how sick they were happened. My mother lowered her voice into that intimate tone she uses when she thinks she's doing persuasion, and she said, if you drop the complaint, we can fix this, we can make it right, we can help you financially, we can help Mila, but you have to stop. And there it is, the bribe disguised as care, because when they can't control you with shame, they try money, and when money doesn't work, they try fear. And I said, you can't buy back a broken arm, and you can't buy back trust. And Marin laughed like I was being cute, and she said, you'll regret this when you're alone. And I said, I'd rather be alone than be surrounded by people who treat my daughter like a punching bag. And then my father said something that I will never forget, because it was the purest confession of what they believe. He said, you always were just like your mother, dramatic, stubborn, acting like a victim. And I said, if defending my child makes me stubborn, good. And then I heard my lawyer's voice in my ear from the phone still on speaker on the hallway table. That's enough. An interaction. So I said one last thing through the door, clear and slow, so it would be clean on the recording. You are not welcome here. Do not return. Any attempt to contact Mila will be reported. And then I stepped away, and for a second there was nothing. And then the footsteps retreated, heels clicking, my father's heavier steps, and the car door slammed, and the engine started. And only when the sound faded did I realize my hands were trembling, not because I doubted myself, but because standing up to the people who trained you to shrink feels like stepping off a cliff even when you know the ground is there. And I walked into the living room, and Mila looked up at me, and her smile faded when she saw my face, and she asked, was that Grandma? And I sat beside her, careful not to bump her cast, and I said, yes. And she said, what did they want? And I told her the truth in kid-sized pieces. They want me to be quiet, and I'm not going to be. And she stared at her cast and whispered, am I in trouble? And my chest squeezed, because that question is the real crime. When a child gets hurt and still thinks they're the one who did something wrong. And I said, no, baby, you did nothing wrong. You said no. And no is allowed. No is a complete sentence. And she swallowed and said, even with family. And I looked at her and said, especially with family. And right there I want you to answer me in your head, because I'm genuinely asking you, if you were me, would you have opened that door? Would you have let them in to talk it out? Or would you have done exactly what I did and kept the barrier between your child and the people who proved they don't deserve access? Because this is where so many people get trapped. They think blood means automatic forgiveness, but blood without protection is just a chain. And I stood up, walked to the window, and looked out at the quiet street like it was a whole new world. And then I went back to the door, waited a full minute to be sure they were gone, and only then did I open it, not to greet them, but to pick up that envelope with gloves like it was contaminated. And I carried it to the kitchen counter, took photos of it front and back, and sealed it in a plastic folder. And when I finally opened it, my stomach didn't drop. My focus sharpened, because inside were printed accusations dressed up as concern, words like unstable and alienating and emotional. And the most insulting part was how confident they were that the system would believe them over a mother with a hospital report and witnesses and photos. And I smiled a little, not because it was funny, but because it told me exactly what was coming next. They weren't planning to apologize, they were planning to attack. And if they wanted a war of paperwork, evidence, and truth, then fine, because I had something they didn't expect from me. I had receipts, I had recordings, I had security footage preserved, and I had witnesses who were finally ready to speak. And the moment I realized that, I felt calm, the kind of calm you feel when the fog lifts and you can see the road. And I turned to Mila and said, hey, after your show, we're going to do something important. And she asked, what? And I said, we're going to write down exactly what happened, not because you have to relive it, but because truth doesn't get to be rewritten. And she nodded slowly, and then she said, Mom. And I said, yeah. And she whispered, are they going to try to take me? And I looked her in the eyes and said, "They can try, but they won't win." And I meant it, and then my phone buzzed again. Not a call this time. A message from an unknown number, just 2 words, cold and confident, like a threat delivered with a smile. "See you." And my stomach tightened, because they weren't done. Not even close. And the next move they made was the one that proved they were willing to burn Mila's peace, just to protect their pride. They didn't wait for court. They didn't wait for the process. They didn't even wait for Mila's cast to come off. Because people like that don't want truth. They want timing. They want to hit you before you're ready. And their next move was so petty and so calculated, I almost respected the audacity if it wasn't aimed at a child. They went to Mila's school and tried to turn the adults around her into their weapons. And I found out because at 9:12 a.m. my phone rang with the school's number, and I already knew in my bones that nothing good comes from a "hi, this is the front office" tone. So I stepped into my kitchen, put the call on speaker, and the secretary said, "Miss Carter, we have a situation. There are family members here asking to see Mila." And for a split second, my whole body went cold, because this is the thing nobody tells you about protecting your kid from your own blood. You don't just fight them in private. You fight them in public places where rules are fuzzy and people don't know the whole story. And I asked, "Who?" Even though I could have guessed, and she said, "Your parents and your sister." And I heard in the background a muffled voice I recognized immediately, my mother's sweet and sickly performance voice. The one she uses in church and at baby showers and anywhere she wants strangers to believe she's a saint. "We're just worried. We just want to check on her. We're family." And then Marin's sharper voice cut in like a blade. "She can't keep our niece from us. This is abuse. She's isolating her." And I closed my eyes and breathed through my nose the way my lawyer taught me, because the moment you sound hysterical, they want to point in the mind of whoever is listening. And I said clearly, "Is Mila safe? Is she with you?" And the secretary said, "She's in class, but they're insisting and they're upset." And I said, "Put the principal on." And while I waited, I could hear my father in the background doing his favorite trick, the reasonable man voice, calm, controlled like the adult in the room. "We're not here to cause trouble. We just need to see our granddaughter. My daughter is emotional. She's making accusations. We want to help." And the thing that makes me want to laugh and scream at the same time is how they always frame themselves as the caregivers, even when they were literally sitting there in silence while a belt came down on a child. And then the principal came on, measured, careful. "Miss Carter," they say, "there's a family emergency and they need to take Mila." And I said, "No, they do not. They are not authorized. I have a restraining order pending and a police report on file. Mila stays exactly where she is." And there was a pause, and she said, "Do you have documentation?" And I said, "Yes, it's in your email from last week. Subject line safety plan, and I can forward it again right now." And then my mother must have heard that word documentation, because her sweetness cracked just enough to reveal the threat underneath. "You see, this is what she does. She lies. She's always been like this, dramatic like her mother." And I could hear the principal's breath change, that tiny moment of discomfort when 2 adults are feeding you opposite stories and you're trying to choose the least dangerous one. And I said, "Please listen to me very carefully. Do not release my child to anyone except me. If they refuse to leave, call the school resource officer." And then I hung up, and my hands were shaking, not with fear but with rage, because what kind of person sees a child with a broken arm and thinks, perfect time to launch a custody ambush at school? And I grabbed my keys, grabbed the folder with my documents, and as I drove I kept rehearsing the same sentence in my head, calm voice, clean words, no emotion, because in these moments emotion becomes evidence against you. And by the time I pulled into the school parking lot, I saw them through the glass doors, my mother standing at the front desk with her palms up like a victim, my father looming behind her with that stiff jaw, and Marin pacing like a caged animal. And the second Marin saw me, she smiled. Not a friendly smile, a got-you smile, and she said loudly so everyone could hear, "There she is, the mother of the year." And I kept walking, steady, and I said to the principal, "Can we speak privately?" And my mother jumped in. No, no private. We're family. We can talk right here. Which is exactly what people say when they want an audience. And I turned slightly so my body was between them and the hallway that led to classrooms, and I said, Mila is not leaving with you. You have no permission to see her, and you will leave now. And my father scoffed. Who do you think you are? And I said, her mother. And that's when my mother tried the old guilt dart. She put a hand on her chest and said, I can't believe you're doing this. After everything we've done for you. We're her grandparents. And I said, you watched her get beaten, and you could see it. That sentence is like sunlight on a roach. It makes them squirm because it's simple, it's factual, and it doesn't leave room for their drama script, and Marin snapped. That's a lie. And I said, there's an ER report, there are witnesses, and there's a police case number. And the principal's eyebrows lifted just a millimeter, which told me she hadn't fully believed me until that moment. And then my mother turned to the principal like she was switching channels, and she said, she's unstable. She's been spiraling. She won't let us see our granddaughter, and we're concerned for the child. And I watched her do it, and I thought, this is why people get trapped for years, because the abuser isn't always screaming. Sometimes they're charming. And then I did the one thing my old self would have been too scared to do. I pulled out my phone and I said, I'm recording. And I looked at my mother and father and said, say it again, tell the principal what you told everyone after the party. Tell her it was an accident, and that Mila fell, and that we should keep it private. And my mother's face tightened because she knew I had messages. She knew I had audio. She knew she had been sloppy when she thought she still controlled me, and she said, this is harassment. And I said, no, this is accountability. And then Marin did what bullies always do when they feel the room shifting. She tried to detonate it. She raised her voice, pointed at me, and shouted, she's poisoning Mila against us. She's turning her into a liar. And I leaned forward slightly and said, Mila doesn't need me to poison her. You broke her arm. And the front office went silent in that way offices do when everyone suddenly wishes they worked somewhere else, and the principal stepped in and said, ma'am, sir, I'm going to ask you to leave. If you have legal concerns, you can address them through proper channels. And my father's face went red, not embarrassed, offended, like the world was refusing to obey him, and he said, we'll be speaking to the district. You can't do this. And the principal said, I can and I am. And that was the first time I felt a real crack in their power, because they bank on authority figures folding to family. And here's an authority figure choosing the child's safety instead. And my mother immediately pivoted, tears on command. This is so humiliating. We just love her. And I wanted to scream, love doesn't leave bruises and broken bones and a child who flinches at raised voices. But I didn't scream. I just said, leave. And the school resource officer arrived, calm, professional, asked them to step outside. And as they walked out, Marin turned her head and gave me that same smile, and she mouthed something without sound. Something meant just for me. Wait. And my stomach tightened because you can feel when someone isn't done, like a storm that hasn't spent its lightning yet. And when they were finally gone, the principal looked at me and said, Miss Carter, I'm sorry, we didn't realize the severity. And I said, now you do. And then I asked the one thing that mattered. Did Mila see them? And she said, no, we kept them here. And I exhaled like I'd been holding my breath underwater. And then I asked, can you walk me to her classroom? And as we walked down the hallway, I could hear my own shoes squeaking on the wax floor, and it sounded too loud, like the building was amplifying how close danger had gotten. And when we reached the classroom door, Mila looked up, and her face changed the second she saw mine. Not fear exactly, but that alertness kids develop when they've learned adults can bring trouble with them. And I smiled at her the calmest smile I could manage, and I said, hey, baby, I'm just taking you to an appointment. And the teacher nodded, and Mila grabbed her backpack with her good arm and walked to me. And once we were in the car, she asked, "Quiet, were they here?" And I didn't lie. I said, "Yes." And she swallowed and said, "Did they try to take me?" And I said, "They tried and they failed." And she stared out the window and whispered, "They don't love me, do they?" And I felt that sentence hit me in the chest like a brick, because no kid should have to ask that. And I said, "They love the idea of control. They don't know how to love a real person, and that is not your fault." And then she said, "I hate them." And I didn't correct her, because sometimes hate is the first honest emotion that saves you from pretending, and I just said, "You're allowed to feel what you feel." And then, as if the universe wanted to prove my point about storms not being over, my phone buzzed again. Not a call, an email notification from the court portal, and I glanced at the subject line at a red light, and my stomach dropped, because it wasn't just a complaint anymore. It was a filed motion with my name on it, and the heading had one word that told me exactly how dirty they were willing to play next. Emergency. The first time I realized they weren't sorry at all was the morning my lawyer emailed me with one word in the subject line, emergency. And if you've ever had family hurt you and then act offended that you noticed, you already know what that word means. It means they're about to flip the story and make you the problem, and that's exactly what my parents and my sister tried the minute the restraining order landed. Because the judge didn't just tell Verena to stay away from Mila, she exposed the whole rotten setup. She exposed the family rules they've been using like a private constitution for years. The one where Verena gets to swing a belt and my parents get to call it discipline and everybody else gets to call it an accident so they can sleep at night. And the moment that court order hit their inbox, their first instinct wasn't, "How is Mila healing?" It was, "How do we protect our image?" So my phone started buzzing like a trapped insect on a window pane. My mother first, then my father, then random relatives who had been silent when my kid was screaming, and all of them suddenly had opinions and spiritual quotes, and "We should keep this in the family." And I need you to understand how ugly that phrase is, because keep it in the family is not about love, it's about containment. It's a lid they slam down on the truth so the stink doesn't get out. And I was not playing that game anymore. So I did what I've learned to do. When emotion tries to drown logic, I got practical. I asked my lawyer what the emergency was, and she told me my sister's attorney had filed an emergency motion claiming I was weaponizing the legal system, that I was alienating the child, that Mila's injury was unfortunate but exaggerated, and that the restraining order was disruptive to family unity. And I actually laughed, not because it was funny, but because it was so predictable. Because abusers and enablers always follow the same script. First they deny, then they minimize, then they blame, and then they try to punish you for not staying quiet. And my lawyer said, calm voice, sharp words, "They're asking for the judge to modify contact and limit your communications with witnesses." And I said, "So they're trying to cut off oxygen?" And she said, "Exactly." And I looked at Mila across our living room, sitting with her cast propped on a pillow, coloring with her good hand like she was trying to glue herself back together, and I felt something in me go from rage to steel. Because when your kid gets hurt, your body becomes a weapon whether you want it or not. Your mind starts calculating exits and threats and distances, and my family had just announced they were still dangerous, not with belts now, but with paperwork and pressure and lies. And that's when I made a choice I wish every parent listening would make faster than I did at that banquet hall. I stopped negotiating with people who only respect force. And I started stacking facts, because facts don't get tired. Facts don't get guilt-tripped. Facts don't care if your mother is crying on the phone. Facts just sit there like a brick, and bricks build walls, and I needed walls. So I pulled out my binder. I'm talking hospital discharge papers, the X-ray report, the doctor's note that clearly said fracture consistent with blunt force trauma, the CPS case number, the police report intake, the screenshots where Verena literally wrote, "She embarrassed my son. What was I supposed to do?" And I printed them again, even though I already had them, because something about paper makes it feel real in court. And I started calling witnesses again, not to gossip, not to beg, but to confirm. If a judge asks you what you saw, you tell the truth. and some people did, and some people suddenly got busy. And those are the people you never forget because silence has a signature. And then my lawyer scheduled a prep meeting, and she looked me straight in the face and said, "They're going to try to make you look hysterical." And I said, "I can do calm." And she said, "Calm is your superpower." And that hit me hard because I've always been the quiet one in my family, the one they mistake for weak, the one they talk over, the one they assign the far end seat to, and I realized something that day. Quiet doesn't mean harmless. Quiet means you're listening. Quiet means you remember details. Quiet means you can repeat their own words back to them with perfect accuracy, and that is terrifying to people who live by rewriting history. So the day of the emergency hearing, I walked into that courthouse like I was walking into a bank to close an account. Neat clothes, no drama, hair pulled back, and my hands were steady even though my stomach was doing laps. And I sat on the opposite side of the room for my parents and my sister, and there they were, all polished up, like they were attending church. My mother with that practiced sorrow face, my father with that tight jaw like he was about to lecture someone, and Verena with her lawyer whispering in her ear like she was the victim of a tragic misunderstanding. And I watched them the way you watch a con artist, not focused on the words, focused on the tells, the little smirks, the quick glances to see if anyone is buying it. And the judge came in, older woman, no nonsense, the kind of face that has heard every excuse in the book and keeps the spine of the book on a shelf as a trophy. And Verena's attorney started with a soft language, family dispute, heightened emotions, regrettable incident, and he kept trying to glide around the broken bone like it was a spilled drink, and the judge let him talk for a minute. And then she asked one question that made the room change temperature. She said, "Counsel, are you disputing the medical record that a 12-year-old sustained a fracture from being struck?" And he stuttered, because you can't cross-examine an X-ray. You can't gaslight a radiology report. And then he pivoted to provocation, which is such a nasty word when applied to a child, because what they mean is the child didn't perform obedience. And I felt my nails dig into my palm, and the judge looked at him and said, "No child provokes an assault by saying no." And I swear I could hear my mother swallow. And then my father did what he always does when things slip out of his control. He stood up without permission, and the judge shut him down with one hand and one sentence, "Sir, sit down." And he sat, and that was the first time in my life I'd seen him obey a woman's authority without arguing, and it was satisfying in a way that made me feel guilty for half a second. And then I remembered Mila's scream, and the guilt evaporated. And then my lawyer spoke, and she didn't give speeches. She gave timestamps. She gave names. She gave quotes. She handed the judge printouts. And when the judge read Verena's text, the one where she justified what she did, the judge's mouth tightened in a way that said, "Oh, so you're not confused. You're entitled." And Verena started crying, the big dramatic kind. And if you've ever been around someone like her, you know that cry. It's not grief. It's inconvenience. It's the sound of consequences arriving. And the judge didn't come for her. She didn't scold her. She just ruled. She said the restraining order stands. She said no contact means no contact. She said any attempt to reach Mila through third parties would be treated seriously. And then she added something that made my chest loosen for the first time in months. She said, "The court's priority is the child's safety, not the adult's feelings." And that line right there is the line my whole family refused to live by, because my parents' entire religion is appearances, and safety is never as photogenic as pretending nothing happened. And when we walked out, my mother tried to catch up, tears, trembling voice, "Please, you're tearing the family apart." And I didn't raise my voice. I didn't give her a speech. I just said, "Your daughter broke my child's arm and you watched." And she flinched like I slapped her, because truth hits harder than leather when you've been protected by silence. And then my father hissed, low and furious, "You're going to regret this." And I looked at him and thought, you really believe regret is worse than living in Fear, you really believe I should have kept my daughter in a cage just so you could keep your reputation clean. And that's when I need to ask you something, because I know some of you were raised on respect your elders no matter what. And I get it, but tell me in the comments right now, where would you draw the line? Because if a broken arm isn't the line, what is? And before you answer, tell me where you're watching from, city and state, or country if you're outside the US, because I want to know how many people out there still think family is a free pass to harm, and then the next wave hit. Not legal this time, social, because once a restraining order exists, people start whispering, and whispers are kryptonite to families who live for image, so my parents started calling relatives to clarify, which means they started lying with better vocabulary. They told people Mila was defiant. They told people Verena was under stress. They told people I was overreacting. And then, the passive hate started, the kind that smiles while it stabs. Cousins posting, pray for our family in this difficult season like my child was a weather event. Aunties sending messages like, I hope you can find forgiveness, like forgiveness is something the victim owes on a deadline. And I didn't argue with them because arguing gives them oxygen. I just kept documenting every message, every indirect threat, every attempt to contact Mila through school friends. And yes, they tried because people like this don't stop. They just changed tactics, and Mila felt it too. She asked me one night, small voice, are they mad at me? And I sat beside her and I told her the truth that no one told me when I was a kid. They're not mad at you. They're mad that you said no and it mattered. And she stared at me for a second and whispered, so no is allowed. And I said, no is holy. And she smiled, tiny, tired smile. And that's when I realized the real revenge isn't court dates. It's reprogramming the child so she never confuses obedience with love again. And I'm going to say this clean. If you're watching and you've ever been the family scapegoat, the one expected to absorb pain so everyone else can keep smiling, I need you to hear me. Protecting your kid is not disrespect, it's parenting. And if you're still here with me and you want more stories where the truth actually wins, join our community right now. Subscribe and stay with us, because the next move my family made was the dirtiest one yet. They didn't come at me through court, they came at me through Mila's school. And that's where the nightmare almost turned into something worse, because I was cooking dinner when the phone rang, unknown number, and a voice said one sentence that froze my blood. We have Mila's school on speaker. Right now, listen. The call came right when the onions hit the pan, and the whole kitchen smelled like that sweet sharp sting that makes your eyes water, even if you're not sad. And I remember thinking for a split second, wow, life is so normal for 5 minutes. And then my phone lit up with an unknown number, and that sick intuition grabbed my throat, because when you've lived around control freaks and image addicts, unknown numbers don't feel neutral. They feel tactical. So I wiped my hands, answered, and a man's voice said, calm like he was reading off a script, we have Mila's school on speaker. And the sound in the background was a muffled office hum, phones, papers, polite voices, and I instantly pictured the front desk, the little candy dish, the poster about kindness on the wall that nobody reads, and then I heard a woman's voice I recognized from parent-teacher nights, the vice principal, and she said, hi, Ms. Carter, we have some concerns that were brought to our attention. And my stomach dropped so fast it felt like I missed a stare, because do you know what it means when someone weaponizes a school? It means they're aiming at the child's sense of safety. They're trying to make the one safe place feel unsafe, and before I could even speak, my mother's voice slid into the call like perfume over smoke, sweet, wounded, performative. Honey, we're just worried. And I swear to you, I could hear the fake tears sitting in her throat waiting for the right moment to fall, and my father added, this has gone too far. Like the restraining order was the violence and not the belt. And then Verena's husband, the coward who stood there that night, said, we just want to make sure Mila is okay. And I stared at the stove, at the little blue flame, and my hand started shaking, not because I was scared of them, but because I could see the play unfolding. They weren't calling to check on Mila. They were calling to plant doubt, to make the school look at me sideways, to make teachers whisper, to make Mila feel like she's in trouble for getting hurt. And this is where I'm going to be very blunt with you. If you're watching and you've ever wondered how certain families keep abuse hidden for decades, it's not magic, it's institutions being used as megaphones for the abuser's story. Schools, churches, neighbors, anyone with authority they can charm. And the vice principal said, "We received information that there may be ongoing conflict at home that's impacting Mila." And my mother jumped in. "Exactly. She's keeping our granddaughter from us. She's isolating her." And I could almost see my mother's hands clasped together like she was praying, like she was the saint here. And I said, in the calmest voice I've ever manufactured, "This call is inappropriate and you're being used." And there was a silence, the kind where people don't know if they're allowed to breathe. And the vice principal said, "Ms. Carter, we have to take every report seriously." And I said, "Good, then take this seriously too. My sister assaulted my daughter. There is a medical record, there is a police report, there is an active restraining order, and this call is a violation of it." And then I heard papers rustling, that fast shuffling sound of someone realizing they don't have the facts, and my father's voice tightened. "Don't do this." And I said, "Oh, I'm doing it." And then I did the one thing that changes everything in these situations. I asked for the email address on the spot. I said, "Give me your direct email, and I will send you the restraining order, the case number, and the incident report within 3 minutes. And I want this documented in Mila's file that third parties attempted to contact the school against court orders." And you could feel the shift, because bullies love the fog, they love confusion, but paperwork is sunlight, and sunlight makes roaches sprint. And my mother tried to interrupt. "Victoria, please, you don't have to embarrass us." And I said, "You embarrassed yourselves the night you watched a child get hit." And then the vice principal, bless her for this, changed tone completely. She said, "Ma'am, if there is a restraining order, we should not be on this call." And I said, "Correct." And she said, "I'm going to end this conversation and call you back directly." And then my mother snapped, actually snapped. She dropped the sweet voice for half a second and said, "Don't you dare hang up." And that was the moment the school heard the real her. Because cruelty always leaks. It can't help itself. And the vice principal ended the call, and the line went dead. And I stood there in my kitchen with the onions burning because I'd forgotten the pan, and I turned off the stove and I sat down on the floor like my legs were suddenly borrowed from somebody else. And that's when it hit me how deep this sickness ran. Because breaking Mila's arm wasn't enough. They wanted to break her reputation, her support system, her sense of belonging, and they wanted to do it quietly while smiling. And I'm telling you, that is a special kind of evil, the kind that pretends it's love. And then my phone rang again, this time the vice principal's direct line, and she sounded different, professional but gentle. "Ms. Carter, I'm sorry. We were told there were concerns about your stability." And I let out a laugh that was mostly disbelief, because stability is the word people use when they want to punish a woman for being loud about harm. And I said, "Let me guess, they said I'm hysterical." And she paused, and that pause told me everything. And I said, "I'm going to email you the documents now. And I'd like a note placed in Mila's record that only I can authorize. Contact, and I want all attempted third-party pickups flagged. And if anyone calls again, I want to direct it to me and not to Mila." And she said, "Yes, absolutely." And I opened my laptop, sent the emails, attached the order, the case number, the hospital report, and I wrote one sentence in the body that I want every parent watching to memorize. Any contact attempted by the restrained party or their associates is a violation and should be documented. And within minutes she replied, confirmed, receipt, and said they would tighten Mila's safety plan. And I sat there staring at that email like it was armor, because it was. And then the next piece clicked into place, because the second they failed at the school, they tried the next target, the neighbors. And I know this because 2 days later, a woman from 2 houses down, the kind of neighbor who always has a casserole and always has an opinion, caught me outside and said, "I heard there was an incident and you're keeping family away." And she said it with that syrup voice people use when they're pretending they're concerned while they're actually fishing. And I looked at her and I said, A child was assaulted and there's a restraining order. And her mouth fell open like she wasn't expecting the truth that blunt, and she said, "Oh my goodness." And I said, "Yes, and I'm asking you not to repeat rumors." And then I walked inside and locked the door because here's the lesson, and I want you to really feel this, people who enable abuse survive on your politeness. They count on you to be nice while they rearrange your life. They count on you to protect their comfort. And the moment you stop doing that, the whole system collapses. And it did, because the next week, my lawyer called with news that felt like a door finally slamming shut. She said the district attorney had decided to proceed with charges based on the evidence and witness statements. And that meant Verena could no longer hide behind family
Discipline.
because the state doesn't care about your family group chat. And when Verena got served, she spiraled. She left voicemails from blocked numbers. She sent messages through distant relatives. She tried to paint me as vindictive, and I did not respond to a single one, not because I was above it, but because every response is a rope they use to pull you back into the mud. And instead, I focused on Mila, because revenge is cute on the internet, but real life is about repair, so we started therapy. Not the dramatic kind, the slow, steady kind, where a child learns that fear doesn't have to be permanent, where she learns that saying no doesn't make her bad. And one night, while we were brushing teeth, Mila looked at me and said, "Mom, do you think they'll ever say sorry like they mean it?" And I looked at her in the mirror, her little face, the healed arm, the eyes that had seen too much, and I told her the clean truth. "Maybe, but your safety is not dependent on their growth." And she nodded like she understood something adults still struggled to accept. And then spring came, and her cast had been off for a while, and we went back to that park I used to avoid, and she ran, and she laughed, and she made friends who didn't treat her like staff. And I watched her from a bench with coffee that actually tasted good, and I thought about the banquet hall, the chandeliers, the gold chairs, the silence. And I realized the biggest plot twist wasn't court orders or convictions, it was this. I stopped begging for a family that never existed, and I started building a smaller one that was real. And yes, the family I came from still tells their version at dinners I don't attend. They still say I overreacted. They still call me dramatic, because that's the only way they can sleep without admitting they watched a child get hurt. But here's the part that satisfies the craving, the part that feels like justice you can taste. Mila doesn't flinch when someone raises their voice anymore. She doesn't apologize for taking up space. She doesn't fetch things for boys who snap their fingers. And my sister, the woman who thought she could break a child and call it discipline, now has a record that follows her like a shadow. And my parents, the people who thought silence was loyalty, now live with the kind of quiet that isn't peace, it's consequence. And if you're sitting there right now thinking, "I would have done the same," or "I would have done worse," tell me, what would you have done the minute that belt came off? Because I want to hear your line in the sand. And if you want the next story that'll hit you in the chest, the one where a perfect family tries to erase a woman with paperwork and she flips the whole table without raising her voice, watch the next video right after this. Because it's not just entertainment. It's a blueprint for what to do when people try to punish you for telling the truth. And once you see how that one ends, you'll never keep it in. The family again.